Well, it's good to see you guys, and over the next couple of weeks we're going to be looking at the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is a collection of sayings that was primarily written by Solomon. It can be a fun book to kind of read. Personally, I have found that it's a little bit of a difficult book to study and to teach, simply in the way that I like to examine things and study them, and I find that Proverbs really doesn't work for the systematic, or actually the lack of systematic way that I like to study things. So over the next couple of weeks, at least while I begin this series, someone else may pick it up as we go, but while I begin this series, it's a little bit of a difficult jump in. So what we're going to do is we're just going to jump in really quickly and remind us the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon, although it does have some inclusions by other writers, and there's a lot of interesting things that you can find out about that and why they may have done that. But it was primarily written towards the young men who would have potentially inhabited Solomon's house, and probably his children, and the men that he expected to leave his kingdom to. It's more than just that, though. It's absolutely useful for us today, because the reminders and the challenges to seek God, to focus on His presence, and those sorts of things are obviously things that transcend time as well as gender. And so we're just going to jump in here. And as we do, I want to just give us a quick thought about wisdom and how it is utilized in the book of Proverbs. And this comes out of our commentary, and our writer for the Explore the Bible series, and this is the commentary. It was a tremendous introduction to the book of Proverbs. So if some of you teachers out there have not used this and utilized this, you really need to do so. That was a tremendous book. He brought us into the book of Proverbs by reminding us of what wisdom is. Now, we all understand that, or have been told, that wisdom is the intersection of intellect or knowledge and something else, okay? And what is that something else? Well, in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Hebrew writings, there's essentially three different types of wisdom that are referred to. The first wisdom that's referred to is ability, okay? And for example, I have knowledge of what it takes to build a house. I have knowledge about what it takes to construct a home. I don't have the ability to completely on my own build a house because I wouldn't know some of the decisions that would need to be made. So I have some intellectual realities there. I have some knowledge. I know it requires wood, concrete, and all those things, and I've utilized and worked with most of that stuff in my life, but I don't have the ability to create a complete house. And you can read in the book of Exodus, when Moses was looking for people to construct the tabernacle, he went looking for people who had wisdom in the construction arts. Okay? So, wisdom is the intersection of intellectual or knowledge and ability. Wisdom is also the intersection of knowledge and practical living. So not only do you have to have knowledge about how you should live your life, you have to collide those two things, if you will. You have to bring them together so that it actually happens. And so you have to examine choices that you make, and you have to examine the opportunities that are before you and how those things shape our lives. And this really is where we're going to be at in the book of Proverbs, this idea of practical living, making good daily decisions. Now, wisdom in Scripture also deals with the reality of human existence. This is more on the intellectual, philosophical side, and you can find this teaching in the book of Ecclesiastes, which Solomon also wrote. You can also find this teaching in the book of Job. And it's an interesting thing to think about, but the book of Proverbs basically says, do X and you will get Y. The book of Job says, I have Y and I never did X. So, if you think about what it means to live a life that is serving to God, honoring God, I realize that the opportunity and the vast amount of resources that we have available to us as believers. So we're going to begin Proverbs chapter 1. We're going to go verses 7 through 19. And if you got your Sunday school guide, you can kind of follow along through that. I really tried to follow the guiding of the editor and the teacher. I probably got a little sidetracked, but that's just a little bit of my nature when I teach. So I'll just have to on that one for you. So my question as we begin this study today is this. If I were to ask you, where did you see God today, this week, this month, whatever, what might you answer with? How might you answer that question? What would be our first thought when somebody says, did you see God in your life, in the life of others this week? Would it be to point towards a religious obligation? Would it be to point towards a religious service? Would it be to point towards where would we begin to answer that? And so I want to challenge us as we start off to think about a man whom we know as Paul. Now, originally his name was Saul. Saul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and you can find that in Acts chapter 9. He met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus introduced himself to Saul with this statement. He said, Saul, what are you doing to me? Why are you chasing me around? And then he said this to him, isn't it hard for you to kick against the goad? G-O-A-D, goad, or sticks. And the picture there is that God is allowing the circumstances of Saul's life to kind of poke him and prod him into possible directions. Saul, on the other hand, is literally assaulting those possibilities, and he's kicking against them. He's fighting back against them. And what the point is this, as we begin to look at this idea of what it means to have wisdom in our daily lives and what it means to bring those things into our daily lives, the thing that we realize and that I have to realize really quickly is my tendency, 100%, is to kick against the circumstances of my life. Now, this is not to say that you should just be simply content with the circumstances of your life and not care and just go along with the flow. That's not what I'm saying. The question that I am saying is, where is God? And culturally, you can take that in any way you like. The reality of it is this. The difficulties of our circumstances are an opportunity for us to see God either correcting us, leading us, giving us, whatever it may be. In fact, I had a few words that I've looked at. Our relationship with God is to be one in which we reflect upon or notice His presence, power, and His potential in our circumstances. And so let's begin by looking at verse 7, and it says this. We're going to read verses 7 through 9. These are in your books if you're following along there. And I'm reading out of the Holman Christian Standard Bible just as you have in your books. And it says this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching. For they will be a garland of grace on your head and a gold chain around your neck. As we begin to study this and we begin to look at this wisdom and having wisdom of God, we have to understand that there's a starting point. Okay? And so that's what we're going to look at today as we get kicked off here, is where is the starting point? Well, the starting point for us begins with Jesus. The starting point for believers begins with Jesus. And Solomon said it like this. And we got to be careful. We got to be careful in how we read these and interpret these words. Solomon says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, I kind of grew up thinking, man, I'm supposed to be scared to death of God. I'm supposed to run around thinking God's about to get me and God's going to, smack me or whatever. I knew the marker was down there somewhere, folks. I knew it. Okay, I dropped it. But anyways, so we have this fear sometimes, a fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. No, what Solomon is saying is this. He is saying recognize God. Do you remember the question we started out with? Where have you seen God? Where have you seen God at work? Have we even seen it? Have we noticed it? You say, man, God's not at work. The world's in shambles. No. Some of the things that we love about the world may be in shambles. People's lives may be in shambles. But God's presence is still very much here. And you can see it. You can see it. I can see it. So our relationship with God is one in which we reflect upon His presence, power, and potential in our circumstances. And so, and I'll challenge you with this, because this is what I had to think about this past week. How do we define what we see about God? Does our view of God, does it look like, well, Jesus told a story. Let me tell it to you like this. Jesus told a story. He was standing near the temple, and he was standing near the treasury, and the Pharisees would walk by, and these were good people. They wanted to do good things. These were religious people that dedicated their lives to doing good things and good works. They'd walk by with their bags of money, and they would, drop them in the bucket, and everybody would go, oh man, that is Mr. Smith over there, and he has just made a difference. And Jesus is standing there, and he sees a woman. In the scripture, he calls her a widow. He says she's a widow. And she walks by and literally just drops 2 mites in there. And Jesus looks around at everybody that's standing around him, and he says, I don't know what you guys just saw. He said, but I know what I saw. He said, that woman put in more than everybody else. So sometimes in my life, I'm standing there next to the temple treasury, if you will. My life, your life. And I'm watching, and I'm looking, and I'm listening for that thump of that bag of gold hitting the bottom. I want to see God, what I would say, God do something. And I miss the person that's getting in the way of all those religious people to give her own little 2 mites. And yet Jesus says that's the most important thing that was done that day. So wisdom begins when we begin to funnel the decisions of our lives through the person and work of Jesus Christ. We're just getting started when we begin to ask what Jesus did. Not necessarily what we think he would do based on our cultural understandings, but what did Jesus actually do in the moments and the circumstances of his life? Then Solomon gives us a contrast. He does this quite often in his writing. He says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, the beginning of wisdom. He said, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. And he said, first thing you need to understand is there's a beginning point, and he said there's a contrasting point. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is sometimes, and maybe you know this, to look back in my life and say, why did I not listen? Why did I not listen? And one of the reasons I didn't listen is because I didn't want to discipline myself, which is one of the very realities that Solomon just brought into the equation. We want to do our own thing. We don't want to submit. Okay? So and our author of this lesson makes this beautiful point. He said the dividing line between the wise and foolish person is not intellect, but a relationship with God. Man, that is a challenging statement. That is a powerful statement. That whether or not my behavior is wise or foolish hinges upon whether or not I involve Jesus Christ and the person of Jesus in the decisions that I make. What an incredible thing. Man, it makes you almost want to walk around with your hand over your mouth all the time. It makes you want to take your hands and put them behind your back when you're looking at social media, or maybe just burn the whole thing, because our tendency is to react as it serves us instead to run it through the funnel of who Jesus is and what he did. So let's go back to Saul for just a minute. So think about this. Saul was trying to do a good thing for God. But his idea of who God was based on his cultural understanding as well as his limitation of God to paper and pen. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. He was not making his decision based on the person of God. He was making his decision based on his performance towards God. Okay? Now, he certainly was not thinking about the God of Abraham. You say, well, wait a minute. He would have thought about the God of Abraham. That was his guy. No, he wasn't. Because the God of Abraham blessed faith. Saul wasn't acting in faith. He wasn't thinking about the God of Isaac. What do you mean by that? Well, the God of Isaac blessed the one who sought him. Saul wasn't seeking God. He was seeking to fulfill his own wishes and desires, and we're going to look at the dangers of that in just a moment. Saul also was not thinking about the God of Jacob. Think about the God of Jacob, the God who came down, met a man who was just absolutely desperate. Everyone was against him. He was literally going back to the guy who the last time he had seen him had threatened to kill him. That's how fragmented and fragile Jacob's relationships were. His life was gone. His father-in-law and his brother-in-laws would have loved to destroy him, and he couldn't go back home there. He had run away from his brother and his dad because of his deceit towards them. And he is so desperate right now that he is going back to his brother and going back to his dad. And he's just absolutely overwhelmed. And God comes down to Jacob in that moment. And he engages him. And we look at this as, oh, Jacob went and wrestled God. Yeah, he did, but that's because God was there. And so Saul, you remember going back to Saul, where did you see God? Here Saul is this religious man, and I'm a religious man. And I'm using this illustration because of how easily I get sucked into this thing of performance. And Saul literally goes out to destroy the world for God. Paul was an authority on Jewish religion, and he appealed directly to his own intellect. Had he reflected on Solomon's challenge here, he may have saved himself and others a great deal of pain. He didn't seek to encounter a God who was present in his daily life. This is our challenge, to begin with wisdom, to begin with our interaction and relationship with our present God. The second thing is, as Solomon begins to build on this, is he says, you need some momentum. Momentum. And the idea here is of a vehicle that is moving down the hill. Y'all, I know about my drawing abilities, or lack of them. Unchecked, that vehicle will gain speed as it rolls. Now, the reality of it is, even a soccer ball would do the same thing, or tennis ball, or a baseball, or whatever it might be. They would do the same thing. They would gain momentum as they roll. So Solomon gives you and I some tips on how to gain momentum in this idea of seeking God in our relationships. And he starts with this one statement. Listen. Remember who his audience is here, okay? Remember who his audience is. He's speaking to young men who are ultimately going to rule the kingdom that he is looking to give the kingdom to. And he says, you need to listen. There is a guard here. And what he's saying is this: you can't live your life simply based on your own experiences. Listen to those whom we have a tendency to disregard. Every generation has to some degree sought to push off the knowledge and the actions of their forebears. And in many ways, that is good, because we get culturally locked into things that are incorrect, and we don't realize how shaped we are by them until the next generation comes up behind us and says, that's ridiculous. And maybe we step back and say, oh my goodness, it is ridiculous. I didn't realize it. I was just doing what I'd always done, you know. But he challenges his audience to listen. The picture here that he gives them is, he says this. He says, if you listen, it's going to be like you have a garland on your head. It's like a crown. It's this natural crown, you know, made of branches, and a medal on your chest. In other words, the behavior that you're going to have, is so going to mark your life that you are going to be noticed where you go for this reason. Now think about this for just a minute. Think of the people in your life who you truly love and admire. How many of those people are listeners? Maybe you have a grandparent that you just absolutely whether they've passed on or they're still alive, you have a wonderful relationship or had a wonderful relationship with them, and you just love that person. Could some of that have come from the fact that they 100% listened to you, that they paid attention to you? And so that person in your mind is someone that you now see, and you see them almost as a decorated person because of that relationship with you. I have a friend, and I actually hadn't even spoken to him, and it's probably been a few years now. But I have a lot of admiration and respect for him. Even though we would probably disagree on a lot of things right now in our lives and the circumstances of our lives and the world around us. But it stems from the fact that when I was a 20-year-old, young, married man, that he legitimately, well, I guess I was a little older than that, but he legitimately honored me and listened to me. In fact, there have been circumstances in my life over the last decade and a half where I would call this person for no other reason. I didn't want their advice. He didn't give me a lot of advice. I would just call him because I knew that if I wanted to say something, he would listen to me on the other end. And I can't tell you what that does to me. Even the memory of that does to me right now. And so Solomon is saying, listen, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction or discipline. He says, stop. And what he says is this: listen to your father's instruction and don't reject your mother's teaching. And there's a double level there. Listen to your father's instruction, don't reject your mother's teaching. In other words, take what is coming in and absorb it and listen to it. And as I was thinking about that, I was challenged about the ways that we could listen. We could listen generationally. I need to listen to the older generation. I need to listen to the younger generation. We could listen culturally. I need to listen to the people who grew up the way that I grew up, and that think the way I think, that function in the world the way I function or have functioned. I need to listen to them. I also need to listen to people who grew up way different than I grew up. I need to listen to people whose skin color is different from me. I need to listen to people whose experiences are different than me. I need to listen to people who are different. You say, wait a minute, if you start doing that, you'll go all over the place. No, not necessarily. You'll learn to value the individual. You'll learn to value the life of someone else. So Solomon says, here's what you need to do. This is where you start at. Fear God. In other words, recognize God's presence in your daily life. And so then he says to his son, and remember, he's giving advice to a person who has got so much potential ahead of him. And by the way, we're eternal beings. We're children of the Most High God. Think of the potential that you and I have ahead of us. Think of the eternal potential that you and I have ahead of us. This world is not the end. There is so much more that is yet to come. So much more experiences that we're going to have. So many more things we're going to have an opportunity to do. And we, right now, are in a crash course preparation for what is yet to come. I think sometimes we think, oh, we're going to die, we're going to go to heaven, and God's going to be sitting up there. Or actually, probably going to have Peter, because, right, St. Peter's got the keys. He's going to have Peter up there with a cattle shocker at the gate, and as we walk by, he's going to, and we're going to magically change. Think on that for a minute. Challenge yourself a little bit. So what are the pitfalls to this? What are the pitfalls to wisdom? Because, at this point right now, wisdom actually sounds pretty good. There's no problem. Most people say, well, I can seek God in my daily life. I can honor God in my daily life. I can learn to listen to other people. It's not the funnest thing, but I can do that. Well, here's the problem. The attraction, looks great. I'm going to use an illustration that I completely understand here. Maybe you don't. I remember watching the action figures be shown on television. The WWF action figures and the commercials, and how these things would do these somersaults and how they would do all these wonderful things. They had all these great looks. And yet when you go to Walmart to buy them, what are you buying? Plastic toy. It doesn't move unless you move it. The attraction of the sinners looks great. Let's remind ourselves what sin is. There's the target right there. Sin is missing the mark. It's hitting out here, out here, out here, out here, or maybe even way over here, right? We may not be anywhere close to the vicinity. But sin is simply missing the mark. So who are the sinners? Well, they're the people that miss the mark. What's the mark? Well, the mark is to fear God and pursue Him. So what does it look like? What do their lives look like? And here's the challenge. They look out for themselves. Look what he says, verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. In other words, realize this. There's people out there trying to entice you. If they say, come with us, let's set an ambush and kill someone. Let's attack some innocent person just for fun. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, still healthy as they go down to the pit. We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us, and we're going to share all of the money. What is the attraction of sin? Well, let's think for just a minute about the person that Solomon is describing here that's trying to entice us. And let's think about why it is attractive. And let's think about some of the things that we say about people around us sometimes, or people that we admire, or people that we want to emulate. And we say things like this. Maybe we say, man, I really admire that person, man. They take no prisoners. Maybe we say something like this. Man, I really like the way she works. She just gets her work done, and she doesn't care whose feelings get hurt. You know, that guy just runs his business. He has made so much money over the years, and the way that he just attacks the market, man, it's awesome to watch. He's a great guy. You see, this methodology sets itself against what Jesus taught and demonstrated. And so let's go back for just a minute to Saul, the guy we started out with. Think about Saul. Man, that guy was getting work done. He's a young guy. He's one of the young people, and they're letting him lead the charge. Remember the story of Stephen, how he's stoned to death? They didn't go find the high priest. They didn't go find the chief Pharisee. They went and found the young whippersnapper who was getting work done, Saul. Brought him out there, and that's the guy that they said, hey, we want your stamp of approval on this. And Saul said, you got it, man. And they took Stephen's life. Because there was a man getting his job done. What does this look like? What does this enticement look like? And why are we not scared away from it? Well, first of all, we're dismissive of the consequences. Solomon tells us this. He says that the sinner says that they're going to do what they do just for fun. What are some words that we say there? We say things like this. Nobody gets hurt. They're the ones that choose to do that. For example, think of some of the stuff that we watch on television. Think of the pornography that's available at the click of a button. Think even of some of the athletics that we watch. Man, you talking like that, it is serious business. It's lives of people. And Solomon is saying, that's just a joke. That's the exploit, one of the attractions is that person says, it's just a joke. It's no big deal. And so we become dismissive of the consequences. And I can't tell you this. I mean, I'm middle-aged now, I guess people would say. And I still, at times, am dismissive of the consequences of my actions. What I drink, what I eat, where I go, where I've been doing. Now, some of you got hung up there and you started thinking about moral behavior, and I'm talking about just human behavior. I'm talking about eating fried chicken 3 times a week. The potential for that to harm me. I'm talking about all these things that we know we can be dismissive of. It's just for fun. It's no big deal. That's one of the things. Look here how he says it. You say, wait a minute. Now, I wouldn't just go attack some innocent person. Except we do. We laugh at the jokes. I mean, I do. I have. I have to fight the tendency to do it again. So we exploit others. Second thing we do is the sinner devalues others. Look what he says in verse 12. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, which is death, the place of death, still healthy as they go down to the pit. And here's the picture here. The person that has no problem with someone else's life being completely consumed by their own. The person is just absolutely content to get what they want out of life. And think about it. Think about some of the changes that have been made in our labor force over the years. Think about some of the changes that have been made in our the way we handle things over the years. And one of the ways that those changes come about is by individuals getting behind the curtain, so to speak, and showing others what it looks like to that individual. You know, we don't think many of us don't think anything of riding through a drive-through restaurant and, you know, rolling down our window and say, I want that cup of coffee. Or at least I don't. I drink coffee. I've said that before, and I like it a lot. And then you roll around to the front window, and whether you're paying $1 for your coffee at Circle K or you're paying $4 for your coffee at Eliana's or Starbucks, we just drink it. That's just the reality of our life. But then along comes this little show on television or this article in the New York Times or something where someone has gone and monitored these coffee farms and has looked at the way that they've done things and produced things. And all of a sudden, our consumption of things or our desire to consume things, it maybe changes. Solomon says that the beginning of knowledge to the fear of the Lord, to recognize God's presence, means that we begin by not allowing ourselves to devalue others. That means every individual that has air on this planet is valuable. I'm going to say that again because I need it. Every individual on this earth that has air in their lungs is valuable. The sinner says they aren't worth anything. The sinner says things like, it doesn't matter, that's their job. The sinner says things like, they're not smart enough to do anything else about it. That's all they can do in their life. Don't worry about it. The sinner says things like, they're scum. Let's dispose of them. The sinner says things like, they're going to keep us from getting what we want. We've got to get rid of them. And devalues others. Okay? So what ends up happening is this. The priority of the sinner becomes self-centered, as we've already looked at. He says there in verse 13. We'll find all kinds of valuable property and fill our houses with plunder. Gain is the goal. See why we're enticed by these people? See why I'm enticed by these people? Because what ends up happening is this: we're going to fill our houses with property. I mean, it's awesome. Boys and girls, we're going to do it. It's awesome. We're going to live like kings. And then what they do, and think about this for just a minute. They help us, they assuage our guilt a little bit. You see how they do that in verse 14? Throw in your lot with us and we'll share all the money. Man, it's not just you. It's join with us. We're a group of people. Folks, we got to be careful about groups. All of them. Okay, God is going to speak to you and I when we stand before Him. He is not going to speak to your family or my family. He's not going to speak to your community or my community. He's not going to speak to your political party or my political party. He's not going to speak to your work or your coworkers. He's going to speak to us individually. That is our responsibility to the Maker of heaven and earth. And a lot of the sinners say, gain is our goal, and we're all in this together. And God's going to take us one day, and He's going to say, no, Daniel, I know you think it was their responsibility. It's not. Let's me and you have a chat. And He has the reality that I've found many, many times. That's the reality that Saul found on the road to Damascus. Saul was just doing the work of the Pharisees. And then Jesus met him on the road to Damascus and said, hey, you and I need to have a chat because you got a problem. Think about this. You ever been given the incorrect change from a cash register? Have you ever been given the incorrect change from the cash register and it be your benefit? Or have you been given the incorrect change and it be to your loss? Which one are we more likely to correct? And we all know that obvious answer. That's the enticement of the sinners. That we're going to get something. And it's not really going to cost us anything. It's just for fun. They didn't really matter anyways. Let's get what we can get. So what is the ultimate impact? What's the ultimate impact of choosing the way of the sinner? Because that's where we're led to today as we go up to verse 19. What is the ultimate impact of choosing the sinner? So to do that, I've got a little parable here. It tells us about a man who grew up in a small homestead with his family, and he built this small farm, and he worked, and he had children. Ultimately, he had grandchildren, and this homestead he had, it was the pride of his life, and he took great care of it. And he, when things would become broken, he would repair them, or if they were unusable, he would put them in a place where his neighbors would know, or he'd go into his community and he would try to pass those things along so that others could take use of them. If he had a surplus crop, he would carry it down to the community and make sure that it was given to the appropriate people and that it got used and it got consumed. But time goes on. His family changed over the years. Ultimately, they grew up. They moved away. He quit interacting with the small community around him as much. And he began to pull back. He began to take his excess and pile it in his backyard near his property line. Take his broken things and pile them in the backyard near the property line. Went out there one day and he noticed that the ground itself had begun to sink. Years before, that would have worried him, would have consumed him. But now he just figured that things were easier. He had a natural trash pit in his own backyard. 25 miles away, the young man's grandson had started his own business. And he bought a piece of land that had a cavern in it, a natural cavern that was full of clear water. And you could go down into that cavern and you could go through the caves and you could visit and you go all these different places. And that young man began to build this business. And over many years, he built a clientele and he became known, and his place became known nationwide for the clarity of the water and the beauty of the underwater caverns that they could explore there. As he got busier and busier, he visited his grandfather less and less. And ultimately, his business fell apart. The crystal clear water which had made his cavern so enjoyable began to become murky at times, sometimes for days at a time, and then it would last for weeks. And the young man every day was now consumed with finding ways to send his guests into different directions so that they wouldn't notice what was happening to his beautiful caverns. Ultimately, it became known and his business became almost worthless. He had more time on his hands, and so he started to go and see and visit his grandfather. The visits began to turn into more visits, and as he spent time with his grandfather, he became encouraged and began to seek him out and began to do things with him, began to work around the old homestead with him. As time went by, he asked his grandfather, he said, "Grandfather, where is the tractor? Where is the old lawnmower? Who did you give that to? Who has your old stuff?" His grandfather said, "Well, son, nobody has it. I just put it back there on the property line." The young man walks back to the property line, and he looks down into what is known as a sinkhole. And he sees tractors, 2 small tractors, an old lawnmower, more tires than you could count, plastic barrels, metal barrels, containers of all shapes and sizes, all mixed in with rotting vegetation. And he knew then what had happened. The water that populated his beautiful cavern 25 miles away had been polluted by his grandfather's disposal. You know, so too, our lives pollute the lives around us. And selfish motivation always leads to destruction. You can take both sides of this, the grandfather, the young man, whichever one, and say their selfish motivation led to destruction. And this is how Solomon sums it up, and I'll read it and stop. My son, don't travel that road with them. Do not set foot in their path, because their feet run toward trouble, and they hurry to commit murder. It is foolish to spread a net where any bird can see it. But they set an ambush to kill themselves, and they attack their own lives. Such are the paths of all who make profit dishonestly. It takes the lives of those who receive it. Let me challenge you today to say to ourselves, where is God? What is He doing? What is happening in our lives? And allow ourselves to be challenged by His presence. Allow ourselves to be changed by His power and see the potential for His Spirit to work in the lives around us. Thank you. God bless you.